Is the public being kept in the dark about the cost of going green? I'm Lucy Johnston and this is GBN Originals. A new analysis from the Renewable Energy Foundation, a charity which publishes energy data, shows that contrary to government claims, renewable energy is costing taxpayers more. It reveals we're spending $25 billion a year in subsidies and have forked out $220 billion since 2002, and yet costs are rising, not falling. Is Britain being sold a lie? Joining me today is Dr. John Constable, Director of the Renewable Energy Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Constable.
Hello, Lucy. Thank you very much for inviting me along to talk.
So, I first want to just sort of discuss your report, which has taken a while, but this report seems to blow the lid off the idea that our energy prices are getting lower because of new energy. And your report shows that we're spending all of this money, $25 billion a year on green energy subsidies. The government actually says that it's less than that, $10 billion. Now, are you saying that they are misleading the public? And how did you actually come to your figure?
Well, the subsidies come in very many forms. There are direct subsidies, which are cash flows to renewable generators. And then there are indirect subsidies, which are market favours that help renewable generators, but create revenue streams to other people. So the direct subsidies, those are levies on bills, increasing costs to consumers directly and transferring that money to renewable generators, are around about $12 billion a year, a little bit over. And then the other half of the $25 billion are indirect subsidies. And those are things like balancing costs in the electricity system. So these are costs to consumers, but the revenue passes to other parties. And similarly, there are expansion of the transmission networks, the grid cables. So subsidy is a complex concept, and government just doesn't tell you the full story, as it were. There are some costs, actually, which are not in the government statements at all. And I do think that is reprehensible, and it's time they really gave an accurate full statement. And we found £1 billion a year in cost from a particular scheme that isn't listed anywhere that we could find in the government statements. So this is an example of a lack of transparency, really. And in some part, it's lack of curiosity from government to find out what's going on. So in the wake of our study, the Shadow Secretary of State for Energy, Claire Coutinho MP, asked some parliamentary questions. And they related to things that we highlighted in the study. And she said, what is the government's estimate of this indirect subsidy? Say the cost of balancing or the cost of expanding grid. And the answer came back from the government, we don't hold that data. Which is very interesting, particularly because in response to our work, they said that it was categorically false. Well, they had no data actually to hand to tell them whether it was false or not. I stand by our numbers. I think they're a very reliable indicator of the kind of order of magnitude of cost that consumers are facing.
What were they based on? Were they based on
our figures? They're based on subsidy statements in the government's own databases and market records, so electricity market records. It's very easy to reference all the sources that we've used.
So you've revealed a total bill, of $220 billion since 2002.
Since the subsidies began, yes.
Yeah, and that's nearly half the NHS budget. And so how come this astonishing figure has been buried until now? Why is no one else raising the alarm?
Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And partly because it's not straightforward to do the work to find out. So you have to be, sufficiently capable with the system. It's a very complex system. Not everybody understands it. I've been working on it for years. My colleague has too. And secondly, of course, government isn't motivated to do it. They believe in these policies. They don't necessarily want to find out that they're failing. We've published things over the years, particularly in relation to the capital and operating costs of wind and solar, which show that actually, quite obviously, that costs are not falling in the sector in spite of all the subsidy. But government wishes to believe that they have fallen. The industry tells them that they're falling, but the evidence just doesn't tell that story. I mean, this is an ideological commitment from the government, and they're just not overly curious to find out whether it's actually working. The actual numbers show that it isn't. So that's the basic explanation. They're not motivated to look. And you might say, well, what about the regulator? What about Ofgem, which is supposed to look after consumers? Well, when Ed Miliband was last in government, under Gordon Brown, he changed Ofgem's remit, their terms of reference. And instead of looking after consumers just as consumers, they have to look after present and future consumers in the light of climate change. So, effectively, what Miliband did at that time was to draw the teeth from Ofgem, so they couldn't ever really criticise the climate policies. Consequently, the consumer has no representative in this debate, except individuals, small charities such as ourselves, who are prepared to do the work, dig into the numbers and find out.
And you've said the government is performing a sort of political sleight of hand. They're saying, and they've put out statements recently, that renewables are cheap. They're going to bring business and jobs to the country, and that costs are going to go down. And can you explain how they're managing to do this to persuade everyone that costs are going to go down and what the reality is?
Well, they persuade people simply by repeating what is obviously not true from their own numerical records of renewable subsidies. There's no evidence that the costs are falling. When we take the total 25 billion a year and divide it by the number of green megawatt hours, units of electricity generated, we find the average subsidy to renewables is rising. And that's not surprising to us. As you add more renewables to the system, it does get more expensive. And so they need to be subsidised more heavily. I mean, it's not odd to say that this is true. And it's surprising, really, that government is persisting in arguing the contrary. The weight of evidence against it is now overwhelming. At some point, this will be unwound. It will have to be unwound because the burden on consumers is getting intolerable. To put that 25 billion into context, it's roughly 40% of the total cost of electricity supply in the UK today, which is about 70 billion a year. So it's a very large part of the total national electricity bill, nearly half. And the sort of things that Ed Miliband is contemplating will take it well over half before long.
I mean, the government sort of insists that they're temporary and that they'll pay off, and that when we have batteries that can store the wind and the solar energy, and with new technologies coming on stream, it will be free energy that we're going to be able to get and not have to rely on what they call volatile gas markets, which they blame our prices for because we're petrostates and dictators they say, dictating our costs, the costs of our gas. But your report's saying the opposite, that costs are rising.
Government do say these things, and very few people who understand the markets believe them, but they're politically convenient. They keep their vote base on side, I suppose, to a degree, and people who don't understand the markets might be convinced of them. But the basic arguments against the cost, claims of falling cost, are physical. And the physical quality of wind and sun is just very poor. Wind is extremely poor. It's close to random heat, as the physicists say. And indeed, if you think about it in a deep sort of way, there are no living organisms, absolutely none, that use wind for their fundamental metabolic energy. It's just not high enough in quality. Solar radiation is a little bit different. Outside the Earth's atmosphere, yes, it's of high quality, but seen from the point of view of a point receptor on the surface of the Earth, say a leaf or a solar PV cell, actually it's very poor because you've got continuously varying angle of incidence, what we call Rayleigh scattering, which is the diffusion of sunlight due to suspended particles in the air, clouds, and the shadow of things like trees and buildings. So on the surface of the Earth, solar is actually quite a poor quality energy source. Yes, there are plants that use it for fundamental metabolic energy, but they're quite simple creatures. They're almost entirely energy storage systems, in fact. And, of course, they don't have complex nervous systems supporting rapid action. So that plant analogy is very important. So you mentioned batteries, and you say, well, is that going to solve the problem? Well, it's a solution which comes at a cost. The batteries are extremely expensive to build, and the way in which they're used will mean that their unit cost of the electricity that passes through them will be very high indeed. So it's a very expensive solution. In other words, you're remedying the defects of the fuel with a very expensive sticking plaster. Now, you could have much cheaper and indeed cleaner electricity from other sources. So we simply don't buy this promise of cheap, renewable energy tomorrow, because it's quite obvious, both from the physics and from the market, the empirical trends in their capex, their capital expenditure, and their operating costs, that this won't be true.
Even with the advent of new inventions and new technologies, different batteries that aren't so expensive, technology is amazing.
They're still going to be very expensive to use. I mean, they have to be extremely cheap for them to be remotely attractive. And they're going to have to be used in ways which will wear them out. And people forget that equipment wears out. So both wind and solar have short lives, economic lives, and they have to be replaced quite quickly. So the capital refreshment cycle, that's the reinvestment cycle, is very rapid in renewables. And this will cause huge burdens for the consumer in the future as we have to rebuild wind and solar fleets. I mean, I don't think we're going to actually rebuild them. I'm on record saying in 30 years' time there won't be any renewables. We'll have seen through this and reverted to sources which are actually able both to sustain well-being for our human populations and indeed produce a long-term and sustainable emissions reduction.
But if we're trying to tackle the climate emergency, then surely we need to do everything we can to reduce the carbon emissions, and surely it's worth it. And we need to have a goal, and we need to work towards something. We may not meet a deadline. Why do you feel that we should be going back to fossil fuels?
Well, we will be going back to fossil fuels. We've never really got away from them, in actual fact. If you're seriously ill, there's no justification for taking some kind of totally inappropriate folk remedy, which might even be toxic, because just because you should be doing something. It may be that you have to be very patient with treatment. It might take a long time. So don't take snake oil when you're ill. So yes, if you think that climate is a very serious problem, then you need a serious approach to its solution. Renewable energy simply won't do it. It's never stood a chance of doing it because it is so terribly expensive.
Is it not doing it anywhere in the world?
No. It's cheaper in certain places for certain functions. I mean, renewables are niche technologies that you can apply in certain areas, but to keep a large-scale economy going, there's really no hope for them. I mean, yes, you can use solar radiation for electricity in remote parts of Africa. It won't be cheap, but it will be cheaper than building a grid line to take power station energy to that remote village, perhaps. But it won't be cheap. And so then they're applicable in niches. But in the UK, no, that's not going to happen. Solar is absurd here. There's a spurious case for wind, but there is a case because it does seem to be windy. But it turns out that actually the lifetime of the equipment is very short, and the balancing costs for wind are extremely high.
So given that we're in a financial black hole, we have debt, do you think that it's impossible to justify spending 25 billion a year on subsidies when people are really struggling to heat or eat? That we have a problem with the cost of living crisis.
I think it's little short of scandalous that we continue to subsidise an industry this long after those subsidies began. We've been subsidising them, after all, since the 1990s, and they're still not economically viable. Now, I would say that's because of their fundamental physics. I mean, we have tried. No one could say that we haven't given the enthusiasts for renewables a fair run. They've had a go. I would have said it was pointless to even let them try, but they have tried. They spent an awful lot of money, over 200 billion, and the time has come just to say, enough's enough. Things are now getting difficult. I mean, the costs are really having a real consequences for people and the economy too. So our electricity consumption in the UK has fallen by 23% since 2005, when the policy costs started to become really apparent. So
you marry those two things together? I mean, it may be
absolutely.
other reasons.
No, it's not efficiency. I mean, people will say it's efficiency, but it's certainly not. Efficiency measures actually make it cheaper to do things. So people tend to use more energy. Not simply that they use more lights in their houses, but there's energy left over to do something else that they'd like to do. So energy is like cash. It's never left on the table. It's always used. So efficiency measures actually increase consumption. So when we look at the falling curve, we know it's not efficiency. Efficiency is visible in that curve because people are adopting efficiency measures to protect themselves against high prices. But that decline in consumption would be even sharper if it weren't for efficiency measures, which everybody should do. I mean, it's a very sensible thing to do. When you're confronted with a government that's loading cost onto your bills, you should try and be very efficient. But no, it's cost pure and simple.
And so that's having it. Well, you've said net zero is the biggest economic intervention since World War II.
Yes.
Previously, and bigger than COVID, the lockdowns, and bigger than the financial crisis. So the sheer scale of the gamble, do you think that the government's just being dishonest about it or spinning it?
I think there's a good deal of honest misunderstanding. I mean, they simply can't believe this has gone wrong. And there is a tendency, and when you've spent a lot of money on a mistake, you carry on in the hope that somehow it's going to turn up round. You know, there is this sunk capital argument. If only they keep going for a few more years, it'll all turn out okay. But no, come now. You know, we've been doing this for 20 years now. Enough is enough. And we have many other demands on our cash. So you are saying, is this the right moment? And have we got other problems? Well, we absolutely have. I mean, people are talking about rearming because of the international situation. The UK defence budget is around about 50 billion a year. The subsidies to renewables are nearly half that sum. I think the numbers speak for themselves.
Well, they do blame the gas market. They've written even recently on that for the high prices.
Yes,
is that
they do say
misinformation?
It's misinformation.
But who's benefiting from that narrative? Why are we shooting ourselves in the foot if that's what we're doing?
Well, because the issue is complicated. I mean, the high prices from renewables were already causing elevated prices in the electricity sector before the Ukraine invasion. Yes, there was a spike in gas prices during that point, but we were vulnerable to those elevated, rising gas prices because we still require gas. It's absolutely essential for security of supply in the United Kingdom. And indeed, I'm on track record in 2004-5 as saying that the renewables policy would make us unduly dependent on gas. And this was not a sensible position in which to be. And that's actually what happened.
If we have an alternative source, why are we more reliant on gas? Is it because
renewables can't replace the conventional sector.
So you're saying that our own gas supplies and our own sources of fossil fuels would be important to keep hold of rather than get rid of them?
Yes, absolutely. And we should be using, every last cubic metre we can get out of the North Sea. And we should think very seriously about fracking. I know people have concerns about it, but I think those can be addressed. And the benefits of extracting our own gas are going to be very great. And bear in mind that there are two reasons why we need the gas. And firstly, gas is very flexible, so generation for electricity, so it's very responsive to changes in demand. And that's what it's doing at the moment. So it's keeping the system going. It's preventing blackouts like that happened in Spain by flexing in order to fill in the gaps. It's ramping up and down in response to fluctuations, uncontrollable fluctuations in the wind and the sun. But don't forget also that gas is absolutely critical for industrial heat, for which there is no renewable substitute. And we absolutely should reindustrialise in the UK. And renewables don't offer any viable way to do that. We need industrial heat. Gas is the only viable option other than nuclear. So small-scale nuclear reactors producing high-temperature heat, very interesting. We should do that too. There's an opportunity cost, in other words, to the money we spent on renewables, the failed renewable experiment, 220 billion. Imagine what we could have done with that if we'd invested in high-efficiency gas turbines, nuclear power stations to generate both electricity and heat. I'm afraid this is an historically significant error in policy.
You say that carbon emissions, our biggest export is that to China and elsewhere, that we're actually exporting our carbon footprint to other countries. Can you just go into that a little bit?
I have said that. It's a bitter truth. Yes, so our carbon emissions have fallen and our GDP appears to be at least not rising as fast as it should do, but at least it hasn't collapsed. So what have we actually done? Well, we haven't decoupled energy consumption from wealth creation, and that's impossible. But what we've done, in fact, is simply to export our carbon emissions to other parts of the world and then borrow money to re-import the goods from Asia, largely, in fact.
So we're not exporting our CO2 emissions. What you're saying is that we're cut down on our own emissions and we're importing goods from elsewhere because we're not, is it as a substitute? Or what exactly do you mean?
Well, we've made our own energy costs so high that we can't make things here economically. And so we've exported production to Asia, and we're borrowing money internationally to re-import goods from Asia. So in other words, we're giving the appearance of wealth here in the UK by borrowing and importing goods. They're manufactured cheaply in Asia using fossil fuels. So all we've done is export our carbon emissions from locally here in the UK. We're now re-importing them, as it were, in the form of goods from Asia. This is not a sustainable solution, and it doesn't make sense as a climate policy either, of course.
No. So how much extra are consumers actually really paying because of the hidden green costs?
Well, our study is of renewable electricity generators only, and that's 25 billion a year. But really, we've only scratched the surface here. There are many other policies too, which increase the cost of living here in the UK.
So the ice cream, the cup of coffee, it's all connected.
Yes, everything. So this is the beginning. As you said, it's at the start, it's hard to understand these costs and dig into them. So this study is sort of first step. Really, government ought to be much more transparent about this, and not just with us as consumers and citizens, but also with themselves. I mean, those parliamentary questions tell you that they don't know. They just don't know what they're doing, and they really ought to be paying attention.
Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, warned that net zero could bankrupt Britain. And do you think that your report is proof that we're on that path?
I think it is. I think you can see that from the falling electricity consumption and indeed falling energy consumption. Our total energy consumption has fallen by about 30% since 2005. So those reductions in energy consumption are historically unprecedented. There's nothing remotely like them in the historical record. And I think very, very serious indicators of economic ill health. So I don't think we'll bankrupt. I think they've already damaged Britain very badly. I'm not saying it's too late to fix the problem. We can still turn this around, but the sooner we start now, it'd be a good time, yeah.
And so supporters of net zero just do argue that offshore wind is getting cheaper. Do you think they're just cherry-picking facts?
There's no evidence in the audited financial statements of the wind companies to support those claims. The capital costs and the operating costs are very high. Indeed, OPEX is rising. And their behaviour tells you that their costs are not falling. And Hornsea 4 has just been cancelled, and they still want more subsidy. They're not ready actually to operate as pure merchant generators, and indeed I think they never will be.
And you've also warned that our grid is now dangerously fragile because of renewables. And there is debate on this, of course, but in your opinion, was the Iberian blackout recently across Spain a sort of wake-up call for Britain? Do you think it was linked to renewable energies?
Well, it's too soon to say exactly what caused that particular blackout, but we know that the Iberian Peninsula is intrinsically a fragile system. It's an island connected with Europe, and that they haven't helped that situation by very heavy commitment to wind and solar. All that's common knowledge. So it was a fragile system. What actually knocked it over on that day, I don't know. It could have been a conventional power station. It might have been the interconnector tripping. I don't know, but it was a fragile system. Here in the UK, we have a fragile system. At the moment, we're throwing consumer money at the problem and staving a blackout off. And I think that'll be the situation for quite a while. So you can keep blackouts, the blackout risk under control if you're prepared to spend very heavily indeed. And that is actually what we're doing. And we can see that in what's called the balancing system use of system costs, called BSUOS in the jargon. In the early 2000s, they were a few £100 million a year. At present, we're spending several billion pounds a year. Nearly all of that increase, as our study shows, even allowing for inflation, nearly all of that increase is due to renewables. So at the moment, we're sort of staving the problem off just by throwing consumer money at it.
Yeah. Britain has some of the highest electricity prices in the developed world. Can you just talk about where we're at with that and what's sort of, do you think that's leading us to a crisis? Is it the highest in the bunch of rich nations, or where do we sit compared to other places?
Well, the relevant comparison is with Asia, really. I mean, it's true that actually our prices are much higher than those in the United States, and Trump is now committed to reindustrialize in the US. And so, yes, that's a very important comparison. If you're a factory owner, a capital investor, where are you going to build a factory? You're going to bring it to the UK, where electricity is extremely expensive, and gas too, come to that, due to short-sighted policies, or are you going to go to the United States, where both are very cheap? It's not difficult to see what they'll do. So we face grave difficulties in actually rebuilding our industrial base here in the UK. And that's very important for the entire population. We're de-skilling because we simply don't have industries of any significant volume, and we need more of them. We're not going to get them unless we have cheap energy. And that's true in all sorts of things, and particularly in the ones that everyone's talking about at the moment, data centers and AI. Without cheap electricity, we're not going to see AI here in the UK. It's not going to happen at all.
But one of the things that we're ignoring in this whole discussion is the climate problem, climate change, the warming of the planet, which I know the government has said is a bigger threat than the net zero policy. It will cause more problems that will be more expensive. So how do you marry that concept? I mean, a lot of scientists believe that.
I think that's very misleading. Most scientists would agree that the problem is manageable at present, and it's a relatively distant problem. So it's perfectly rational to have a climate policy, but your climate policies have to be rational, and ours plainly aren't. They're wildly expensive. So they have a measure of this. It's called the social cost of carbon. A strange term, but it means the monetized estimate of the danger to human welfare from releasing a ton of carbon dioxide.
Human and environmental, the animals as well, and the plants.
Yeah, any ton of carbon dioxide. And the estimates range, a huge range actually, from minus $700 a ton through to several thousand positive. Most estimates are around about $50 to $100 a ton. And at that value, adaptation is certainly more sensible. And the abatement cost, that's the cost of deploying renewables, it's way in excess of these estimates of social cost of carbon. So the cure is worse than the disease. We shouldn't be doing this. It'd be much more sensible to spend money on abatement. As I said, it's perfectly rational to have a climate policy, but by insisting on doing it with renewable energy, you put those policies on a collision course with human well-being, and that means they're going to fail. I mean, they will be rejected. So if you care about these policies, you should think very carefully about redesigning them so that we can actually keep on doing them. I think it's reasonable to have, as I say, reasonable to have a climate policy in the longer term, but it should be flexible and it shouldn't be a threat to human welfare. And people talk about the existential threat from climate change. Well, that's not true. It's a more manageable, distant threat. But there is an existential threat from high-cost energy policies, which are manifestly damaging the UK very badly. Falling electricity, falling energy consumption is a very serious matter.
So you're saying that climate policy itself is a bigger existential threat than climate change? So
yes, mistaken.
Is there economic
policies.
Evidence for that? Mm-hmm.
Well, the collapsing energy consumption is all that you need for that. The subsidy costs that we're paying show that this is the case. If the technologies were viable, we wouldn't be still subsidizing them to a tune of $25 billion a year.
You said that the Energy Department, the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, is operating in the shadows and they don't have proper public scrutiny. How do you think this secrecy is damaging democracy and empowering vested interests?
Well, you think of $25 billion a year on the bills. That's imposed by policies put through by Energy Security and Net Zero under Ed Miliband. I mean, he's now talking about fiddling with the rules for budgets relating to one of the subsidies called contracts for difference for big renewables, like offshore wind.
Can you explain what contracts for difference are?
They're a guaranteed price, in effect.
Okay. For the renewables, yeah.
Yes, a guaranteed high price, which also gives them a guaranteed market share so they can sell everything that they generate. And he's talking about lifting the restrictions on budgets so that the companies can ask for quite high levels of subsidy, one imagines. Well, based on the current levels of subsidy required, those decisions could add another 10 billion a year to the cost of electricity in the UK. Now, imagine the Chancellor proposing a tax which put 10 billion a year onto, say, income tax and corporation tax. There would be a national storm. People would be very upset. There'd be a lot of discussion in Parliament, to put it mildly. But the Secretary of State at Department of Energy and Security Net Zero can do these things quietly and without full public scrutiny. So they're a little bit like private finance initiatives, if people remember those. It's a way of keeping costs off the books and in the shadows, where they're not fully visible, they're not susceptible to democratic audit. And I think that's wrong. And the experience with private finance initiatives shows that when people learned how bad it was, that public trust was very badly eroded. And I think that's going to happen.
That was when money was money was borrowed to pay for hospitals and other infrastructure at high interest rates, and we have to pay it back. I think we're still paying it back. It was a financial catastrophe, and the same is true for the renewable subsidies. They spent these huge sums. There's no evidence of them actually reducing renewable energy costs, and the Secretary of State's in these various, the Conservatives have some share of the blame, of course. They didn't start these policies, started under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband when he was Secretary of State. And the Conservatives' failure was really to get them under control. I mean, they never really tried very hard to do so. So it's cross-party blame, I think, in fairness to them. But Tony Blair's interesting, isn't he? Because recently he's come out and said, we may need an energy policy, like you say, but we're going to just bankrupt the country and we're going too far and too fast. Is that, and he's been kind of on record, hasn't he? Just sort of changing.
Yes. Very interesting intervention, which it seems that he was pressured into retracting. But I think he got it right the first time. And people have said lots of things about Tony Blair. They've never said that he didn't have good political antennae. He's very sensitive to these things. He understands. And he could see that these climate policy costs are actually quite dangerous. So he's gotten onto something there. And he's also very practical. He's a practical politician, one of the most successful in recent generations. So I think that wise heads in the Labour Party should be listening pretty carefully to that warning. Muted and gentle though it was, it wasn't a particularly strong statement in my standards, but he's sensible about this. And if Starmer is a sensible politician, he'll be trying to rein Miliband in.
So just some final closing points, and it's been really fascinating to talk to you and to dig in there. But if you were in charge tomorrow, what is the first thing you would do to bring down the energy bills?
Well, the first thing is no new subsidies to renewables. We stopped that immediately. And we tried then to start to unwind the existing subsidies. So we start getting renewables off the system. Unfortunately, we can't do it all in a rush. I mean, the fact of the matter is that madly expensive and fragile though they are, renewables are a large part of the electricity supply. So we'd have to unwind it fairly gently, but certainly no new subsidies. And we need to build high-efficiency combined cycle gas turbines rapidly so that we can start to transfer electricity consumption from costly renewables to lower-cost gas. And we need to start planning carefully and rapidly for a nuclear rebuild, both for heat, for industrial heat, and for electricity.
There's always the fear of a nuclear leak. We've had those in the past. Very dangerous. That's not something you would be concerned about.
I live quite close to the sites of Sizewell B and proposed Sizewell C sites, so I certainly take those things very seriously. The sort of reactors I'm thinking of are gas-cooled reactors, high-temperature gas-cooled reactors. We had them in the past in the UK. We turned our back on that. It might be worth rethinking that decision. They're much safer, actually, in many respects. And in this case, also cheaper to build smaller units, and they operate at a high temperature, so they can contribute industrial heat.
Okay, so just a final word. Is net zero achievable without bankrupting Britain in the end, or is it time to call a halt and rethink the whole policy?
I think you could probably achieve a very low emissions economy in the longer term. Remember, we've got to unwind the failed renewables policies first. I mean, it's going to take time. I would say to those who feel very sincerely about the green policies that we've wasted 20 years on this renewables agenda. Correcting that error is going to take time. I'm sorry about that, but it will. We can't do anything about it. If we'd had a gas and nuclear policy in the early 2000s, we would now be in a much better position. Our electricity wouldn't be so maddeningly expensive, and we'd probably actually be cleaner. So it's a question of, well, if you want to do net zero, I wouldn't start from here. But here is where we are. So we just have to put up with that. The Greens are in many respects to blame for this, actually, for taking us down this blind alley. I've no objection to decarbonising the economy at a reasonable pace and without causing serious reductions in human well-being and national weakness. But doing it from here, it's going to take a while.
Dr. John Constable, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
And if you want to read the full Renewable Energy Foundation report, go to your website, Renewable Energy Foundation. And it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for explaining all of that to us. Okay, bye-bye. The government has seen this report, and a spokesperson for the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero said, "This analysis is categorically false, ignores the benefits of clean power, and significantly overestimates the cost of renewables. As shown by the National Energy System Operator's independent report, clean power by 2030 is achievable and will deliver a more secure energy system which could see a lower cost of electricity and lower bills. Levies drive investment in renewables and other generation technologies which will secure Britain's independence and protect bill payers from future energy shocks." Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel for more.